Capital, Volume 1. This independent recording by Andrew S. Reitenberg is public domain, both in content and in audio. Chapter 17. Changes in the magnitude in the price of labor power and in surplus value. The value of labor power is determined by the value of the means of subsistence habitually required by the average worker. The quantity of the means of subsistence required is given at any particular epoch in any particular society, and can therefore be treated as a constant magnitude. What changes is the value of this quantity. There are, besides, two other factors that enter into the determination of the value of labor power. One is the cost of developing that power, which varies with the mode of production. The other is the natural diversity of labor power, the difference between the labor power of men and women, children and adults. The utilization of these different sorts of labor power, which is in turn conditioned by the mode of production, makes for great variations in the cost of reproducing the worker's family, and in the value of the labor power of the adult male. Both of these factors, however, are excluded in the following investigation. I assume 1. That commodities are sold at their value. 2. That the price of labor power occasionally rises above its value but never sinks below it. On these assumptions, we have already found that the relative magnitudes of surplus value and of price of labor power are determined by three circumstances. 1. The length of the working day, or the extensive magnitude of labor. 2. The normal intensity of labor, or its intensive magnitude, whereby a given quantity of labor is expended in a given time. And 3. The productivity of labor, whereby the same quantity of labor yields in a given time a greater or smaller quantity of the product, depending on the degree of development attained by the conditions of production. Very different combinations are clearly possible, since one of the three factors can be constant while the other two vary, two factors can be constant while one varies, and finally all three may vary. In addition, the number of possible combinations is augmented by the fact that, when all these factors vary simultaneously, the amount and direction of their respective variations may differ. In what follows, the chief combinations alone are considered. Section 1. The length of the working day and the intensity of labor constant, the productivity of labor variable. On these assumptions, the value of labor power and the magnitude of surplus value are determined by three laws. Firstly, a working day of a given length always creates the same amount of value, no matter how the productivity of labor and, with it, the mass of the product and the price of each single commodity produced may vary. If the value created by a working day of 12 hours is, say, 6 shillings, then although the mass of the use values produced varies with the productivity of labor, the value represented by 6 shillings will simply be spread over a greater or less number of commodities. Secondly, the value of labor power and surplus value vary in opposite directions. A variation in the productivity of labor, its increase or diminution, causes the value of labor power to move in the opposite direction, while surplus value moves in the same direction. The value created by a working day of 12 hours is a constant quantity, say 6 shillings. This constant quantity is the sum of the surplus value plus the value of the labor power, the value of the labor power being replaced with an equivalent by the worker himself. It is self-evident that if a constant quantity consists of two parts, neither of them can increase without the other diminishing. Let the two parts be equal at the beginning, and let 3 shillings be the value of the labor power, and the same for the surplus value. Then the value of the labor power cannot rise from 3 shillings to 4 without the surplus value falling from 3 shillings to 2, and the surplus value cannot rise from 3 shillings to 4 without the value of the labor power falling from 3 shillings to 2. Under these circumstances, then, no change can take place in the absolute magnitude either of the surplus value or of the value of the labor power without a simultaneous change in their relative magnitudes. It is impossible for them to rise or fall simultaneously. Further, the value of the labor power cannot fall, and consequently surplus value cannot rise without a rise in the productivity of labor. For instance, in the above case, the value of the labor power cannot sink from 3 shillings to 2 unless an increase in the productivity of labor makes it possible to produce in 4 hours the same quantity of means of subsistence as could only be produced previously in 6 hours. On the other hand, the value of the labor power cannot rise from 3 shillings to 4 without a decrease in the productivity of labor, so that 8 hours are required to produce the same quantity of means of subsistence as were previously produced in 6 hours. It follows from this that an increase in the productivity of labor causes a fall in the value of labor power and a consequent rise in surplus value, while, on the other hand, a decrease in the productivity of labor causes a rise in the value of labor power and a fall in surplus value. In formulating this law, Ricardo overlooked one thing. Although a change in the magnitude of the surplus value or surplus labor causes a change in the opposite direction in the magnitude of the value of labor power, or in the quantity of necessary labor, it by no means follows that they vary in the same proportion. It is true that they increase or diminish by the same quantity, but their proportional increase or diminution depends on their original magnitude, before the change in the productivity of labor took place. If the value of the labor power is 4 shillings, or the necessary labor time is 8 hours, and the surplus value is 2 shillings, or the surplus labor 4 hours, and if, owing to an increase in the productivity of labor, the value of the labor power falls to 3 shillings, or the necessary labor time to 6 hours, the surplus value will rise to 3 shillings, or the surplus labor to 6 hours. The same quantity, 1 shilling or 2 hours, is added in one case and subtracted in the other, but the proportional change of magnitude is different in the two cases. The value of the labor power falls from 4 shillings to 3, i.e. it falls by 1/4, or 25%. But the surplus value rises from 2 shillings to 3, i.e. it rises by 1/2, or 50%. It therefore follows that the proportional increase or diminution in surplus value resulting from a given change in the productivity of labor depends on the original magnitude of that portion of the working day which is embodied in surplus value. The smaller that portion, the greater the proportional change. The greater the portion, the less the proportional change. Increase or diminution in surplus value is always the consequence and never the cause of the corresponding diminution of increase in the value of labor power. Since the working day is constant in magnitude and is represented by a value of constant magnitude, since there corresponds to every variation in the magnitude of surplus value an inverse variation in the value of labor power, and since the value of labor power cannot change except as the result of a change in the productivity of labor, it clearly follows under these conditions that every change of magnitude in surplus value arises from an inverse change of magnitude in the value of labor power. If then, as we have already seen, there can be no change of absolute magnitude in the value of labor power and in surplus value unaccompanied by a change in their relative magnitudes, it now follows that no change in their relative magnitudes is possible without a change in the absolute magnitude of the value of labor power. According to the third law, a change in the magnitude of surplus value presupposes a movement in the value of labor power, brought about by a change in the productivity of labor. The limit of this change is given by the altered value of labor power. Nevertheless, even when circumstances allow the law to operate, subsidiary movements may occur. For example, if, as a result of an increase in the productivity of labor, the value of labor power falls from 4 shillings to 3, or the necessary labor time from 8 hours to 6, the price of labor power might well fall only to 3 shillings 8 pence, 3 shillings 6 pence, or 3 shillings 2 pence, thus allowing the amount of surplus value to rise only to 3 shillings 4 pence, 3 shillings 6 pence, or 3 shillings 10 pence. The amount of this fall, the lowest limit of which is 3 shillings, the new value of labor power, depends on the relative weight thrown into the scale by the pressure of capital on the one side and the resistance of the worker on the other. The value of labor power is determined by the value of a certain quantity of means of subsistence. It is the value, and not the mass, of these means of subsistence that varies with the productivity of labor. It is, however, possible that owing to an increase in the productivity of labor, both the worker and the capitalist may simultaneously be able to appropriate a greater quantity of means of subsistence, without any change in the price of labor power or in surplus value. Let the value of labor power be 3 shillings, and let the necessary labor time amount to 6 hours. Let the surplus value be, similarly, 3 shillings, and the surplus labor time 6 hours. Now, if the productivity of labor were to be doubled without any alteration in the ratio between necessary labor and surplus labor, there would be no change in the magnitude either of the surplus value or of the price of labor power. The only result would be that each of these would represent twice as many use values as before, and that each use value would be twice as cheap as it was before. Although labor power would be unchanged in its price, it would have risen above its value. However, now assume a fall in the price of labor power. Not as far as 1 shilling 6 pence, the lowest possible point consistent with its new value, but to 2 shillings 10 pence, or 2 shillings 6 pence. This lower price would still represent an increased quantity of means of subsistence. In this way it is possible, given increasing productivity of labor, for the price of labor power to fall constantly, and for this fall to be accompanied by a constant growth in the mass of the worker's means of subsistence. But in relative terms, i.e. in comparison with surplus value, the value of labor power would keep falling, and thus the abyss between the life situation of the worker and that of the capitalist would keep widening. Ricardo was the first to give an accurate formulation of the 3 laws we have just stated, but his presentation of them suffers from the following defects. 1. He views the special conditions under which these laws hold good as the self-evident, universal, and exclusive conditions of capitalist production. He recognizes no change either in the length of the working day or in the intensity of labor, so that with him the productivity of labor becomes the only variable factor. 2. And this error vitiates his analysis much more than 1. He has not, any more than other economists, investigated surplus value as such, i.e., independently of its particular forms, such as profit, ground rent, etc. He therefore fails to differentiate between the laws governing the rate of surplus value and those governing the rate of profit. The rate of profit is, as we have already said, the ratio of the surplus value to the total capital advanced. The rate of surplus value is the ratio of the surplus value to the variable part of that capital. Assume that a capital C of £500 is made up of raw material, instruments of labor, etc., which, taken together, we shall call small c, to the amount of £400, and of wages V, to the amount of £100. And assume further that the surplus value S is equal to £100. Then the rate of surplus value will be S over V equals £100 over £100, 100%. But the rate of profit will be S over C, £100 over £500, 20%. It is obvious, moreover, that the rate of profit may depend on circumstances which in no way affect the rate of surplus value. I shall show in Volume 3 that the same rate of surplus value may be expressed in the most diverse rates of profit, and that different rates of surplus value may, under certain circumstances, be expressed in the same rate of profit. Section 2. The length of the working day and the productivity of labor constant, the intensity of labor variable. Increased intensity of labor means increased expenditure of labor in a given time. Hence, a working day of more intense labor is embodied in more products than is one of less intense labor, the length of each working day being the same. Admittedly, an increase in the productivity of labor will also supply more products in a given working day. But in that case, the value of each single product falls, for it costs less labor than before, whereas in the case mentioned here, that value remains unchanged, because each article costs the same amount of labor as before. Here we have an increase in the number of products unaccompanied by a fall in their individual prices. As their number increases, so does the sum of their prices, whereas in the case of an increase in productivity, a given value is spread over a greater mass of products. Hence, if the length of the working day remains constant, a day's labor of increased intensity will be incorporated in an increased amount of value, and assuming no change in the value of money, in an increased amount of money. The value created varies with the extent to which the intensity of labor diverges from its normal social level of intensity. A given working day, therefore, no longer creates a constant value but a variable one. In a day of 12 hours of ordinary intensity, the value created is, say, 6 shillings. But with increased intensity, the value created may be 7, 8, or more shillings. It is clear that if the value created by a day's labor increases from, say, 6 to 8 shillings, then the two parts into which this value is divided, namely the price of labor power and surplus value, may both increase simultaneously, and either equally or unequally. They may both simultaneously increase from 3 shillings to 4. Here, the rise in the price of labor power does not necessarily imply that it has risen above the value of labor power. On the contrary, this rise in price may be accompanied by a fall below its value. This always occurs when the rise in the price of labor power does not compensate for its more rapid deterioration. We know that, with exceptions which are purely temporary, a change in the productivity of labor does not cause any change in the value of labor power, nor consequently in the magnitude of surplus value, unless the products of the industries affected are articles habitually consumed by the workers. But here this limitation falls to the ground. Whether the magnitude of the labor changes in extent or in intensity, there is always a corresponding change in the magnitude of the value created, independently of the nature of the article in which that value is embodied. If the intensity of labor were to increase simultaneously and equally in every branch of industry, then the new and higher degree of intensity would become the normal social degree of intensity, and would therefore cease to count as an extensive magnitude. But even so, the intensity of labor would still be different in different countries, and would modify the application of the law of value to the working days of different nations. The more intensive working day of one nation would be represented by a greater sum of money than the less intensive day of another nation. Section 3. The productivity and intensity of labor constant, the length of the working day variable. The working day may vary in two directions. It may be either shortened or lengthened. From our present data, and within the limits of the assumptions made at the beginning of the chapter, we obtain the following laws. 1. The working day creates a greater or lesser amount of value in proportion to its length, thus a variable and not constant quantity of value. 2. Every change in the relation between the magnitude of surplus value and the value of labor power arises from a change in the absolute magnitude of the surplus labor, and consequently of the surplus value. 3. The absolute value of labor power can change only in consequence of the reaction exercised by the prolongation of surplus labor upon the wear and tear of labor power. Every change in this absolute value is therefore the effect, but never the cause, of a change in the magnitude of surplus value. We begin with the case in which the working day is shortened. 1. A shortening of the working day under the conditions given, i.e., with the productivity and intensity of labor constant, leaves the value of labor power, and therefore the necessary labor time, as it was before. It reduces the surplus labor and the surplus value. Along with the absolute magnitude of the latter, its relative magnitude also falls, i.e., its magnitude in relation to the magnitude of the value of labor power, which remains constant. Only by reducing the price of labor power below its value could the capitalist compensate himself for this fall. All the usual arguments against the shortening of the working day depend on the assumption that the phenomenon occurs under the conditions presupposed here. But in reality, the very opposite is the case. A shortening of the working day either follows upon or immediately precedes a change in the productivity and intensity of labor. 2. Lengthening of the working day. Let the necessary labor time be 6 hours, or the value of labor power 3 shillings. Also, let the surplus labor be 6 hours, or the surplus value 3 shillings. The whole working day then amounts to 12 hours, and is embodied in a value of 6 shillings. If the working day is lengthened by 2 hours and the price of labor power remains the same, the surplus value increases both absolutely and relatively. Although there is no absolute change in the value of labor power, it suffers a relative fall. Under the conditions assumed in Case 1, there could not be a change of the relative magnitude in the value of labor power without a change in its absolute magnitude. Here, on the contrary, the change of the relative magnitude in the value of labor power is the result of the change of absolute magnitude in surplus value. Since the value product in which a day of labor is embodied increases with the length of that day, it is evident that the surplus value and the price of labor power may simultaneously increase, either by equal or unequal quantities. This simultaneous increase is therefore possible in 2 cases. The first case is an absolute increase in the length of the working day, and the second case is an increase in the intensity of labor unaccompanied by an increase in length. When the working day is prolonged, the price of labor power may fall below its value, although that price nominally remains unchanged or even rises. The value of a day's labor power is estimated, as will be remembered, on the basis of its normal average duration, or the normal duration of the life of a worker, and on the basis of the appropriate normal standard of conversion of living substances into motion as it applies to the nature of man. Up to a certain point, the increased deterioration of labor power inseparable from a lengthening of the working day may be compensated for by making amends in the form of higher wages. But beyond this point, deterioration increases in geometrical progression, and all the requirements for the normal reproduction and functioning of labor power cease to be fulfilled. The price of labor power and the degree of its exploitation cease to be commensurable quantities. Section 4. Simultaneous variations in the duration, productivity, and intensity of labor. It is obvious that a large number of combinations are possible here. Any 2 of the factors may vary and the third remain constant, or all 3 may vary at once. They may vary equally or unequally, in the same direction or in opposed directions, with the result that the variation cancel each other out, either wholly or in part. Nevertheless, every possible case can easily be analyzed by using the results obtained in cases 1, 2, and 3. The effect of every possible combination may be found by treating each factor in turn as variable, and the other 2 as constant for the time being. We shall therefore restrict ourselves here to a brief discussion of 2 important cases. Case 1. Diminishing productivity of labor with simultaneous lengthening of the working day. In speaking here of diminishing productivity of labor, we are particularly concerned with those industries whose products determine the value of labor power. We have in mind, for example, diminishing productivity resulting from the decreasing fertility of the soil, and from the corresponding increase in the price of its product. Assume a working day of 12 hours and a value product of 6 shillings, half of which replaces the value of the labor power, the other half forming the surplus value. Then let a rise in the prices of the products of the soil occur, so that the value of labor power goes up from 3 shillings to 4, and the necessary labor time therefore rises from 6 hours to 8. If the length of the working day remains unaltered, the surplus labor will fall from 6 hours to 4, and the surplus value from 3 shillings to 2. If the day is lengthened by 2 hours, i.e. from 12 to 14 hours, the surplus labor will remain at 6 hours, and the surplus value will remain at 6 shillings, but the relative magnitude of the surplus value will decrease in comparison with the magnitude of the value of the labor power, as measured by the necessary labor time. If the day is lengthened by 4 hours, i.e. from 12 hours to 16, the proportional magnitudes of surplus value and the value of labor power, of surplus labor and necessary labor, will continue unchanged, but the absolute magnitude of surplus value will rise from 3 shillings to 4, and that of the surplus labor from 6 hours to 8, an increment of 1/3, or 33 1/3%. Therefore, with diminishing productivity of labor and a simultaneous lengthening of the working day, the absolute magnitude of surplus value may continue unaltered, at the same time as its relative magnitude diminishes. Its relative magnitude may continue unaltered at the same time as its absolute magnitude increases, and finally, if the working day is lengthened to a sufficient extent, both may increase. In the period between 1799 and 1815, an increase in the prices of the means of subsistence led in England to a nominal rise in wages, although there was a fall in real wages as expressed in the quantity of the means of subsistence they would purchase. From this fact, West and Ricardo drew the conclusion that the diminution in the productivity of agricultural labor had brought about a fall in the rate of surplus value, and they had made this assumption, which was purely a product of their own imagination, the starting point of important investigations into the relative magnitudes of wages, profits, and ground rent. But as a matter of fact, surplus value had at that time increased both in absolute and in relative magnitude, thanks to the increased intensity of labor, and to the prolongation of the working day which had been forced upon the workers. This was the period in which the right to prolong the working day without any restriction at all became accepted as one of the basic rights of the citizen. It was also a period especially characterized, on the one hand, by a rapid growth of capital and, on the other hand, by a rapid growth of pauperism. Case 2. Increasing intensity and productivity of labor with simultaneous shortening of the working day. Increased productivity and greater intensity of labor both have a similar effect. They both augment the mass of articles produced in a given time. Both, therefore, shorten that portion of the working day which the worker needs to produce his means of subsistence, or their equivalent. The minimum length of the working day is fixed by this necessary component, which is, however, itself capable of further contraction. If the whole working day were to shrink to the length of its necessary component, surplus labor would vanish, something which is impossible under the regime of capital. Only the abolition of the capitalist form of production would permit the reduction of the working day to the necessary labor time. But even in that case, the latter would expand to take up more of the day, and for 2 reasons. First, because the worker's conditions of life would improve and his aspirations become greater, and second, because a part of what is now surplus labor would then count as necessary labor, namely the labor which is necessary for the formation of a social fund for reserve and accumulation. The more the productivity of labor increases, the more the working day can be shortened, and the more the working day is shortened, the more the intensity of labor can increase. From the point of view of society, the productivity of labor also grows when economies are made in its use. This implies not only economizing on the means of production, but also avoiding all useless labor. The capitalist mode of production, while it enforces economy in each individual business, also begets, by its anarchic system of competition, the most outrageous squandering of labor power in the social means of production, not to mention the creation of a vast number of functions at present indispensable, but in themselves superfluous. The intensity and productivity of labor being given, the part of the social working day necessarily taken up with the material production is shorter, and, as a consequence, the time at society's disposal for the free intellectual and social activity of the individual is greater, in proportion as the work is more and more evenly divided among all the able-bodied members of society, and a particular social stratum is more and more deprived of the ability to shift the burden of labor, which is a necessity imposed by nature, from its own shoulders to those of another social stratum. The absolute minimum limit to the shortening of the working day is, from this point of view, the universality of labor. In capitalist society, free time is produced for one class by the conversion of the whole lifetime of the masses into labor time.